which is not only are Jews unfairly tainted as the oppressor, when in fact, as I've said, obviously Jews are victims of the majority of hate crimes in the West. But now the resistance to this supposed oppressor, of course, of the state of Israel, is being publicly justified by academics with positions of moral authority. So it's deeply concerning. And just to touch on the point that you raised with regards to the treatment of Israeli academics in international conferences and the like. So Haaretz, a major Israeli newspaper, recently published a report that I highly recommend reading, delving into what they describe a potential new phase for Israeli academia, where Israelis are being excluded from academic scholarship and opportunities at a level never previously seen. And again, this is something that Jewish groups have been warning of for years with the growth of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. But what we've seen since October 7th, again, against all, common sense, obviously October 7th should have been a moment to recognize this sadly historic day of Jewish victimhood. But the inverse has happened, and academics are actively avoiding, refusing contact with Israelis. So, cancellations of invitations to conferences, a freeze on appointments of Israelis in foreign institutions. You have the rejection of scientific articles. There are professors that describe pitching articles to academic publications that they are used to publishing in and receiving excuses about, why they can no longer publish Israelis. And what's really concerning is, of course, human beings are easily influenced. I think it just takes one or two individuals within institutions who are afraid or who are unjustifiably angry or even perhaps anti-Semitic themselves to complain about being involved with Israelis, and then others follow suit. And we've seen really a lack of leadership within academia in standing up to these institutions. And because Israel is such a young country, although it's had a huge amount of success in the academic field, both in the sciences and the humanities, despite all of its success, it's a young country, and it relies on larger and more established institutions in the West in order to really impact change in the humanities and the science fields. And so I think this exclusion could have potentially catastrophic consequences for Israeli academics, and it's something that's deeply concerning.
It's not only the exclusion of Israelis and also Jewish communities around the world. There are Jewish scholars who are not based in Israel, but just for them being Jews. That's the only thing. The only thing that a university or a conference, etc., take in mind and say, like, no, you are not welcome. But it's not only this, as you mentioned, Tamara.
Yeah.
What we have witnessed is how academia, and let me name it, left and the right, the both sides, the way the attacks were justified academically, and how they started talking about it, that this is what liberation should look like. What did you expect from a liberation movement? That's the type of violence you should expect. I mean, the type of justification, not only this, is that as the conflict continues, almost October 7th is being omitted from the discussion. It's no longer part of the discussion that a horrifying act of genocide committed by Hamas against civilians. It's no longer part of the discussion, whether by academics, I mean, even by big names. I mean, Judith Butler, for example. Let me name here. I think it's important that we name things as they are. Judith Butler thinks that Hamas is the power of the left. I mean, why all of this?
Yeah. I think it's a really good point. Obviously, Judith Butler, a well-respected feminist scholar, some would say a feminist icon, defending Hamas's armed armed resistance and downplaying anti-Semitism is deeply, deeply concerning. I think it really is the success of the oppressor-oppressed paradigm, which I hold to be incorrect, by the way, meaning I don't believe that global politics operates within this paradigm. But even if one does, let's say even if one believes part of the scholarship that Edward Said sort of brought into being within the humanities, that the West is historically responsible for colonization, and that people of color have been subjugated. The idea that Jews within this paradigm are the oppressors and the white colonizers rather than being people of color is something that I've always failed to understand. Thinking of Judith Butler, of course, within the feminist movement, within all civil rights movements within the United States, Jewish scholars and professors have always been at the forefront in fighting for minority rights. They've been at the forefront, really in spearheading a lot of these new academic fields and studies that have enabled someone like Judith Butler to proclaim the kind of platform that she enjoys. And so I think really all of this can quite evidently be blamed and sort of placed with anti-Semitism, meaning ultimately this is the only rational explanation for why Jews are being wrongly tainted as the oppressors, and why armed resistance is being justified in the halls of academia. When in fact, October 7th was a historic day of mourning for the Jewish people. And we've absolutely seen, Jewish students and of course Jewish professors being targeted as well. And I think there's a real culture on campus where it feels as though the Jewish people have lost. And again, this is something that, the advocates of the diversity, equity, and inclusion frameworks and the ways in which that excludes Jews and the advocates of intersectionality, this is something that they won't admit. In some cases, they do admit it, but by and large, they will paint their anti-Semitism, let's say, as justified by couching it in this sort of language of, rising up against the colonizer, rising up against the sort of white nationalist, with the Israeli being unfairly tainted as the white nationalist. So I think there's a real culture within academia where Jews and Israelis will continue to be excluded unless something changes. My one hope is that I don't know how this can be sustained over time, because October 7th was such an unprecedented historical event. I mean, it's still an ongoing event. I wish it was history, but of course the unrest in the region and the hostages are still being held by Hamas. October 7th is still ongoing, but it was such an unprecedented event and an unfortunate example of a success on the part of Hamas that I'm not sure how much longer they can sustain this, because they're so used to being in opposition, at least when it comes to global politics. That's sort of their main fuel, is claiming to be the victim, claiming to be, at least in global politics, on the side of the underdog, even though in academia, arguably, they've been victorious for many decades. But now we're seeing this sort of reversal where, unfortunately, in global politics, we're seeing, a plurality of young Americans siding with the actions of Hamas over Israel. And we're seeing Israel, unfortunately, existentially threatened by Hamas, by Iran and its proxies. And so I do wonder whether inevitably a shift will have to come on campus, because they can no longer plausibly claim that Hamas is the underdog post-October 7th. And logically, my hope is that their arguments will begin to crumble.
Now, academia, Tamara, is not limited to the academics themselves, right? It's also, it extends to other generations. We are talking here about students who attend the classrooms where they might hear that when talking about anti-Semitism, you are overreacting. Anti-Semitism is being used too much.